So let's move on to slavery. The reality is, to win a war in the pre-modern period, it was all about manpower. The main factor in whether your people would live or die was numbers. So this meant that if you won a battle, you couldn't just let the captives go, because they would just regroup and attack you again or join your enemies. So you only had two options. You either had to kill or enslave. Neither option is good, right? But that's just the nature of war. You always have to use violence against the other side. You either kill or enslave. So Harris, you want to criticize Islam and call Islam barbaric for having slavery, but imagine if I asked you this question. Do you support using weapons in war? Do you support using guns to shoot people or swords to stab people and kill people? Do you support that? Because all of that is violent. All of that is barbaric. Presumably you'd say, yeah, of course I support weapons and killing, because how else are you going to fight war and defend yourself? Well, that's exactly the point with slavery. In the pre-modern period, you couldn't have war without slavery any more than you could have war without weapons and killing. In other words, if killing people can sometimes be justified, then slavery can also sometimes be justified. And this is exactly what your friend, apostate prophet, accepted with open arms in our debate last year. Imagine in the future they invent a new technology for war where a laser shoots from space and can directly target any person in the world. And the technology is so precise that there are zero casualties other than the intended target. Then people in this future might look back at our time and say, look how barbaric those people in the 21st century were. Look how barbaric with their tanks and guns and bombs. Would that make any sense? That's exactly what you're doing by criticizing Islam for slavery. You should just acknowledge that slavery could be completely justified in certain circumstances, which, by the way, are the circumstances people have lived in for 99% of human history. Now, if you want to argue that Islam requires enslaving people today, I would say that that is not correct. It depends on the imam. If you read fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, this is very clear. There's no requirement that people captured in war are enslaved. This is discussed in classical fiqh books. For example, Bidayat al-Mujtahid by Ibn Rushd in the 12th century. Go to Kitab al-Jihad, and he summarizes the position of the four Sunni schools of fiqh. The imam has the option to pardon people and forego taking slaves in war. The imam does not have the option to suspend, for example, hudud punishments for lashing, like lashing for fornicators. But taking slaves is one of those issues where the imam can forego if it's in the best interest of the Muslim community. So in modern times, a hypothetical imam could exercise this option and still be 100% consistent with the most strict understanding of traditional Islamic law. Now, Harris, since you seem to be ignorant about these details about Islamic law, I'll do you a favor and steelman your argument for you. You could respond to me and say, well, Daniel, fine, slavery could be justified in the past, but now with modern technology, modern weapons, clearly slavery could never be justified. That means Islamic rules regarding slavery are not justifiable in our modern context, which means at least one aspect of Islamic law is obsolete. And if one aspect of Islamic law is obsolete due to modern technology, then why not all of Islamic law? This is actually the argument that a lot of Muslim liberal reformists make, but the response to this is simple. In the past, the low level of technology meant that in order to wield political power, war was necessary, which meant that slavery was necessary. The only difference today is there are bombs, nukes, fighter jets, drones, chemical and biological weapons. So now war is not about manpower. Basically, you have to believe that these new technologies are such a blessing, and we're better off because, at the very least, no one needs slavery to defend themselves, right? We live in a world of nukes and drones and weapons of mass destruction, so slavery is no longer needed. So the question is this actually a better world? Well, the harms associated with modern technologies like nukes and drones and mass surveillance, and you can't go to the bathroom without security agencies constantly monitoring your every move and every communication, these harms are far, far greater than the harms that existed in Islamic slavery. Frankly, these modern technologies are more terrifying. We have to look at the whole package. Which is the better world? One with the constant threat of nukes, nuclear annihilation, and constant terrorizing of the world's poor people with trillion-dollar weapons programs? Let's ask the people of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, or the Vietnamese children with horrifying birth defects because of chemical weapons like Agent Orange. Let's ask the Palestinian and Syrian refugees or children who are being burned alive with white phosphorus. In light of these modern technological horrors, the practice of Islamic slavery actually seems a far better alternative in the context of war, even if it were practiced today. Now, let me get to the point about sex slavery. A good book I recommend is Lawrence Keeley's War Before Civilization. He explains that pre-modern war was primarily about manpower. The side that had the largest army was usually going to win. And if you had too few people, this made you an easy target for a larger group to attack you and wipe you out. This meant that women were very valuable in pre-modern societies because your society's ability to reproduce and build up the population is limited by the number of fertile wombs you have. Keeley says, and I quote, "Although the loss of even a large percentage of males will have no direct influence on a group's demographic fortunes, the loss of or gain of fertile women can mean the difference between population decline and growth." This is why Keeley argues all pre-modern civilizations took sex slaves. Again, this was a necessary aspect of war. If you did not take concubines, you were at a major disadvantage militarily because you either take concubines or your people get wiped off the face of the earth. There is no third option. So given that stark reality, yes, taking sex slaves was not only morally justified, it was morally necessary. And really, that's enough for the argument, but it's worth noting that the Sharia's rules on concubines and slaves in general are the most humane out of any other civilization. Again, slavery is not supposed to be a fun time, but Islam explicitly gives slaves many rights. They can't be mutilated, they can't be killed, they can't be prostituted. For women, if she gives birth to her master's baby, the baby is free, and she also is freed automatically when her master dies. These rules ensured that captured slaves very quickly integrated within larger Islamic society, especially after 1 or 2 generations. Contrast this with other societies in history that maintain a permanent subjugated slave class based on race or ethnicity. Islamic slavery is not like that, and that's why we see, for example, the Mamluks in the Middle Ages, who were a ruling class of Muslim slaves and the descendants of slaves, some of whom even reached the level of sultans and emirs in the Muslim caliphate as slaves.